Okay, Jannie, welcome on the stage. The stage is yours. Would you like to present yourself?
Yeah, that's okay. Yeah.
What do you do in daily life?
I'm an architect. I was trained in Delft University as an architect, and I'm involved in housing, in building housing, renovating housing, researching housing, urban planning and housing. Also a bit in teaching about housing to architecture students. So.
Would you understand anything from the speech?
In the end, I got that it was about experience, but that's as far as I got.
Okay, and what are you going to tell us?
I'm going to tell a little bit more about recent developments in senior or elderly housing in the Netherlands, policy changes that we have been dealing with, and also a research that we initiated ourselves about new concepts for elderly housing related to the changes in society and also changes in policies.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so this slide I can already skip. A little bit, I already explained, I'm an architect. I have my own office in Amsterdam called Anna Architects. Since 20 years we are very much involved in housing. We've done a lot of building projects in housing, research projects, individual housing, renovations, urban planning. And recently we have initiated a research project on senior, new concepts for senior housing, and I will tell a sort of brief story about what's happening in the Netherlands and also how we are trying to come up with solutions for that. First, a comparison, which I think is maybe interesting to see. We are a really small country compared to Sweden, but we have more people. If you compare the situation now, Sweden has already to deal with more seniors than we have. So 80% of the Swedish population is above 65, and in the Netherlands it's only 15. A slight difference. We are in the midfield in Europe. Germany and Italy have to deal already with more than 20% seniors. But if you look at the situation in 2050, we will in the end have 30% people over 65. And then for Sweden, the percentage is 26. So we definitely have to think of strategies to deal with this also in housing. The costs, of course, for care rise in all European countries related to this aging phenomenon, and especially in the Netherlands. This is an interesting scheme because here you see that the Netherlands and Sweden both now have a situation in which the costs for long-term care are quite high, relatively high also compared to other European countries. And with this prognosis of the aging in 2050, you see that if we don't act in the Netherlands, we will have unaffordable costs for elderly care. So we definitely have to come up with strategies. Our government, national government, also realized this and has already initiated some changes, policy changes. And one of the things is that we had a situation in which before last year actually, in which it was for a big group of people, a big group of elderly people, provided to live in care homes. Even when you were a little bit disabled or you have slight traces of Alzheimer, you could move into an elderly care home and all service was provided. We had this indication system from 1 to 10, and everybody was allowed to live in care homes, and everything was provided for. Now the policy changes. For instance, one of the major changes is that this is only now available for a limited group. So you have to have quite strong disabilities, you have to have far-fetched traces of Alzheimer in order to be able to live in a care home. Or actually, you could say it's not a care home anymore, it's more a nursing home. So this is one of the major changes, and another change which our government tries to initiate is to put more emphasis on self-reliance, make people responsible for their own situation. So when you are in need of care, you first have to see what you can do yourself, what your network, your surroundings, your family, your neighbors can do for you. And then if there's no help in your own surroundings, if you can't organize things yourself, you can ask for help from the state. Another change is that all the responsibilities for the care of elderly is decentralized from the national government to the municipalities, with a budget cut back from 25%, so that's quite enormous. And especially when you consider that the amount of care needed is more and more because of the aging society. And domestic help was also quite well provided in the Netherlands, but this is also reduced strongly. So those are changes that were that started this year. So that means a big change in our society. Everybody rethinking how to deal with this. And one of the things, for instance, is that we have been with this system we have been building a lot of these care homes. These are typical images of those typical Dutch care homes, very efficient, large estates, efficient in how to provide care. Large-scale estates with all service included, and now a large part of them are emptying because they're not so attractive anymore to live in when the care is not provided anymore. So one of the big questions we have to deal with is what to do with all these buildings. Are we going to transform them into independent apartments for seniors? How can these buildings compete? Because people have a choice if they want to live there now. Are they attractive enough? Or do we transform them into housing estates for other groups? Or do we demolish them? Another aspect which we think is very important to think about in our current society, especially when we have to rethink elderly housing, is that we have to deal with a very diverse group of elderly. Especially if you compare those future elderly to the group of elderly that was used to live in these care homes. They were quite happy, easily satisfied, but this more critical generation that is coming wants to have choices and wants to have more diversity in living standards. And we also think that it is also very much time to really ask elderly people what they actually want. So we haven't done that good enough, I think. And especially now with the changes, the policy changes that we have to deal with, this is a very important thing. So this is why we initiated this research project. In Dutch it's called Grijstint in de tussenmaat. It's quite hard to translate. Mid-sized grey tones would be more or less what it means. And the aim of our research is to develop attractive alternatives. And grey tones suggest that we think there is not just one alternative, there should be a whole variety of alternatives. And in the tussenmaat, the mid-size, means that we think that the solution for future elderly is not in the large-scale projects, is also not in the small individual scale projects, but is somewhere in between, where we think on a small scale of collectivity could be organized. People are able to organize things together, and we think that this provides solution for this future generation of elderly that has to stay in their own home and take care of themselves. We work in a multidisciplinary team, so I'm one of the architects. We work with two architects, a care specialist and writer, researcher on this project. We have involved 3 steps in our research, and the first step is actually to look abroad. We think that it's very interesting to look at successful examples in other countries and also relate that to developments in other countries. So these are some of the countries we're looking at. Germany, for instance, is very interesting because Germany is the second most aged country in Europe and has already developed interesting strategies which are very much based on the intergenerational solidarity principle. Denmark is also an interesting country where the responsibility for care is already decentralized to the local authorities. Italy is interesting because it's the most aged country in Europe and it doesn't have so much institutional care, so their self-organization is very much a topic. Switzerland has a lot of very beautiful and very well-organized examples. And we are also looking at Sweden, because Sweden has quite high welfare standards, and we're also very interested in how Sweden deals with this new phenomenon. So what we do is I just show a few examples of projects we have been visiting and also we have been researching. This is actually a Swedish project in Stockholm, which I think is a very interesting example We have similar projects in the Netherlands, but it's also interesting to see how Swedish deal with this idea. What is interesting of looking at these foreign examples is we want to see how are different aspects of collective co-housing for seniors, how it is organized. So how do these projects get realized? Who is taking the initiative? What are the roles of the people who live in these projects? How are they involved in developing a project? What is their role in organizing living? What is the amount of collectivity and how is this organized? And how does it relate also to the spatial configuration of the buildings? We also think it's interesting to look at typology. So how does this way of living together reflect in the building typology? What is interesting about this example, I think, is that it almost feels like a self-organized care home. People really take care of everything themselves, and from 50 to 90 people live there. We also saw a project in Denmark, which is all the way in the opposite, I think, of the scale of collectivity. It's a more individual way of living. It's a very attractive alternative for young elderly who really are very much fond of their privacy. And this is a project that was initiated by a group of elderly themselves, built together. Patio houses where so the idea of living in the landscape was translated into a more collective form in which this landscape is taken care of collectively or paid for the maintenance collectively. And the amount of collectivity is far less than, for instance, the previous project. This is a project we still have to visit, but I think it's interesting. It's a Swiss project in which also, again, initiated by a group of people. Where there's a mixture of younger generations and older generations, families, seniors, and also a mixture of individual living and more collective living within one building structure. So I'm really curious how it functions and how people perceive this way of living. So this is one part of our research is to investigate these foreign projects on different aspects. And another part of the research project is to have dialogue with this future elderly. We think it's very important to talk to these people about all these aspects that we're also researching in the reference projects. What do they think about living? What do they think about their surroundings, the place where they live? What do they think about the facilities that need to be there in the surroundings, about the public space, but also how do they feel about collectivity? What amount of collectivity do people find attractive? What do they want to share with each other? And how much privacy do they need? And we notice in the discussions we have had until now with seniors is that there is a great variety in ideas about this. And the third step of our research project is to do several case studies in different sites in the Netherlands, different types of sites also. I'll show you only one that we're involved in, which is in quite an interesting area, Almere, which is quite a big city I think it's the 5th or 6th city in the Netherlands. It's a Dutch new town. It was founded in the 70s and completely built after that. And the municipality of Almere has made one of the older neighborhoods of the city, Almere Waterwijk, into a pilot area for senior-proof living, because this is not one of the older ones. It was built in the beginning of the 80s. In only 3 years' time, the whole neighborhood of 8,000 dwellings was built. And a lot of the original inhabitants are still living in the neighborhood, but you can see this is typical housing there. It's all row housing, more or less. Over 80% of the houses is row houses, so it's like 5 meters wide, 2 stories high. I think I have a slide with a typical floor plan of a house. We have in the Netherlands, this is a very common type. We have a lot of those dwellings. And especially from this period, the 80s. And in this neighborhood, the people living in these houses is aging. So their children have moved out, and now many of them are still living in these big houses and wondering what to do. Do they stay in this house with these large gardens to maintain, or do they move out and look for alternatives? People are very much attached to their neighborhood. They know the neighborhood well. They know a little bit more or less people who live in the neighborhood, so they want to stay there, but there is not really an alternative for them. So this is more sort of a schematic representation of the problem. We have an area with 83% of the houses row houses, and only 9% of the houses is an apartment. So there, for elderly who want to move to a house without stairs, there's only this limited amount of houses. And if you look at the households living in the houses in Almere, only 51% of the houses is occupied by a family at this moment. 41% of a family with 2 parents, 10% with a family with 1 parent, and 49% of the houses is inhabited by 1 or 2 persons household. So most of them seniors. That's the situation right now. And then if you look at the prognosis for the demographical development of the area, from 2013 to 2025, the amount of seniors will double. And this is the 65 plus definition of senior. There are a lot of definitions of seniors, of course. So you can imagine that this problem, it's not yet really a problem, but there will be a situation. And the municipality of Almere has already stated we should think what to do with neighborhoods like this, because we have plenty of those neighborhoods in all of the country. And it's very interesting to think of strategies. So, for instance, they have made a calculation: what if we would build new projects for these seniors that want to move out of these family homes? Then we need 30% extra elderly-proof houses. If you would build those, and then if you would assume that also the amount of families in this neighborhood would reduce even more, let's say 10%, that's what we stated in this scheme, then you would end up with the yellow houses, which more or less 65% of houses which are unsuitable for people living in this area. So this is actually a scheme to state that we can't solve the problem of senior or aging society only with building new concepts. We also have to think what to do with these existing houses. And that's also what the municipality of Almere has asked us to do within our research study, to think with them, what can we do with these existing houses? How could we make them senior-proof? Is it possible to do that? Another aspect is that these houses, most of them are privately owned, so that also makes it quite hard to do anything collectively, to organize anything collectively. So what we said until now is that we think if you want to make this neighborhood a vital neighborhood, and make a neighborhood which is future-proof, not only senior-proof, but really future-proof, you should have an integrated approach. You should not only build new projects, but you should also look at the existing housing stock. How could you transform that, or how could you make that more suitable for the future inhabitants of the neighborhood? What can we do about care? How could this be organized in this neighborhood? The social networks are very important also for the seniors, and the environment, of course. The public space surrounding these dwellings is all made for families, with a lot of playing grounds for children. But with this aging group living there, it's also important to think about that. There is an idea that if you want to start doing something in this neighborhood, you should concentrate also the proposal, the strategies aimed at the seniors around the existing facility centers. Not start somewhere at the edge of the neighborhood, but really focus it on the central zones, because that's one of the things that people we have spoken to in workshops also said, that the vicinity of shops and healthcare facilities and also public transport is for them very important. So that's one of the things. Then we have been looking at possibilities to transform these individual houses, make them senior-proof. Of course, one of the easiest things you could do, and that's what happens already a lot, is that you put a stair elevator. If you have physical disabilities, you cannot go up the stairs anymore. People have a stair elevator installed, and then you can stay there longer. Of course, this is not really a long-term solution, because when this stair elevator has to be, when the person who lives there dies or has to move out, then the house is not appropriate for anybody else. So We think you also have to develop more long-term strategies. For instance, build extensions to these houses so that people can live completely on the ground floor, and maybe even rent out the first story of their house to a young person. But also develop strategies for other groups, how to make these houses for future younger groups, make them more attractive. So maybe divide houses into smaller units. Those are strategies aimed at the individual house, but you could also imagine that it would be interesting to think of strategies that you focus on a row of houses, because then, for instance, you could add an elevator and a gallery and make apartments on the ground floor and on the first floor, have maybe a collective garden, a collective space that people can share. So you can transform these individual row houses into a small-scale collective housing project. But this is quite complicated when we have to deal with all privately owned houses, of course. We also showed to the inhabitants, in order to communicate with them about these ideas and how they think about it, how it could work. That you need to have a sort of strategy in which you do some things top-down, transform some of the rows collectively, but also have individuals involved in investing in their own private houses. And then the municipality, for instance, could invest in public space, which is also more suitable than for seniors. So we have a sort of collective approach in which everybody contributes. We also proposed or discussed with the people in the neighborhoods small-scale new developments, small-scale collective housing projects, concepts, based actually on some of the projects we've seen before. Different typologies, and discuss with them what appeals to them, what they prefer, how much emphasis for them is on the public space or on collectivity, on the typology of the house, etc. So, and then we put up a lot of pages on walls of all these ideas that we've come up with, and have them sticker them with different colors to have people also say something about what they feel is a good idea for themselves, which means a green sticker, for which they think is really a bad idea with a red sticker, but also what they think is a good idea not for them but for the future of the neighborhood with the blue sticker. So this is the way we try to involve people and have them also discuss with us how they feel about these ideas. And another aspect of this research is that we think in order to get something like this done in a neighborhood like this, you really need also an integrated financial and organizational approach. You cannot depend on the individual people to invest in their homes alone. You need to also have the municipality involved, or you need also maybe investors involved in doing things on the scale of the neighborhood. So it's a bit complicated to explain this whole scheme, but also on that aspect you need an integrated approach, we think. So this was sort of the brief story on, I don't know what time. It's okay. Then this was about the state of our research until now. We're actually in the middle of it, and this is one of the case studies. We try to finish this whole research project this year somewhere, so maybe another conference I can tell you more about the results. And also how this ends up. This is quite an interesting experiment to see, but I'm really anxious to see how we can really get things really done. And then I want to finish with some other projects that we did as an office outside of this research that are about elderly housing, and also address themes that I think are interesting and also are relevant in the Netherlands about senior housing, and might be interesting also for the Swedish situation. So for instance, this is actually a very small scale project. It's only 12 houses in the existing village. It's 3 rows of 4 houses, with in each row 2 houses for elderly and 2 houses for young families. So really bring groups together on a small scale. Having people also involved, talking about the layout of their house. Maybe I can. Well, this is more or less a principle. This was a project we did in Belgium, which is also about mixing groups, young people and old people, having a flexible building structure that could adapt to both groups. Another project about mixing groups in an existing building that will be transformed. Another aspect is when you do something for the seniors, when you build something new, that I think it's also important to do something that adds something to the neighborhood. So for instance, in this project, we propose to make a collective living room, which is also available for the neighborhood. An interesting phenomenon in the Netherlands that we have to deal with is what we call reverse integration. We have a lot of estates that were built for disabled people, and they were sort of closed-off estates, big park with a fence around it, and now we are transforming also these estates by putting in new houses. But you still have a lot of facilities in these areas. There are still, some of these people are still living there. And it's interesting to have, especially for elderly, it's an interesting concept because they can use the facilities, the services that are already there and live in a very interesting environment. And an old phenomenon that is very famous abroad from the Netherlands is beguine communities that were founded in the 14th century already. We have a lot of those really beautiful examples in the existing city. Those complexes were founded by rich people in order to house the poor people, especially singles, women mainly. And there was also a collective garden always. And we have done a project with a foundation that came from this origin together and built a sort of new modern example of this way of living around the collective courtyard, having shared spaces. So this was more or less very brief, my story about the Dutch only housing.
This song, I think it was very encouraging to listen to you because we are not alone in the world. Yeah, Sweden got a very good, you said it was a high-level standard.
Well, that's my perception.
Have you been visiting any elderly housing in Sweden?
Well, not apart from the Vartkneppen in Stockholm. No.
Okay.
But I've been talking to people about what is going on here, of course.
Okay.
So, what's your advice for us to have something like going to design senior dwellings, so to speak? What's the Dutch perspective?
Well, I think what is good to see is that what I think is good for elderly housing in general, and I think in Sweden there's definitely also a breeding ground for this, is to have people more involved. So the future seniors are very active people, very much involved people, and have been working all their lives, and they are able to do things. So I think it's very important to listen to them, to have them say what they need, what they want, and also to have them do things, be active also when they're old.
I do think so. You're also right. This involvement of participation when doing these projects, I think it's a clue for success. Yeah. We are so lucky here because we have 800,000 Swedish seniors represented at this conference through their organizations.
Yeah.
And that's part of our plan, to involve people, those who is concerned for this. So I'm very confident in what you are saying because that's coming up in Sweden too, to involve all these groups when to actually do the projects.
Maybe I can add one other thing that I think that struck me in Sweden is, and that I think is something that you have to be aware of, is that it's a scale. I really believe in if you want to have people organize things yourself, I think in Sweden it will become also a phenomenon that people have to do more and more themselves before they can actually use state facilities.
Yes.
If you want to make this possible, I think you need a comprehensible scale. And the housing in Sweden is quite large scale, I think. So I think it's a point of attention to really consider how to create small-scale environments, comprehensible scale building complexes, to make it attractive for elderly and also to feel connected to this, not feel alone and anonymous.
We have been putting a personal question to every speaker, and that is, how do you want to see yourself? Let's say you are 80, where will you live? What is your housing? How is the world around you?
80, that's quite far.
You haven't been thinking about it?
No, I begin to think more and more that I also want to not wait with making a step to a housing situation in which you can really get old too long. I think it's important to make this step early in life, and then you can have an attractive last stage of life. I think so, and I really believe also in this collectivity. So and in living in a neighborhood. I also live in a neighborhood. I really know the people who live in my street and also around the corner.
But you are creating a world for other people.
Yeah.
And if you create a world for yourself,
that would be definitely in the neighborhood. I would like to live in a collective building somewhere, or in a complex, or in a situation where there is space for collectivity, where we can share things with each other in a neighborhood, in existing, and where there are also other people living. So not only not only 18.
That sounds great.
Yes.
Thank you very much for coming here.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Nice to